Welcome to the Bicurian Podcast. I'm Eric.
I'm Aicila.
And this week we are going to talk about guns.
We have a really clever title. I'm very proud of it.
Up in Arms About Guns.
Yeah, there you go.
So we debated a little while about what the real question here is. And we could probably spend a lot of time analyzing, the science that I've seen coming out now that if there was no guns, then these mass shootings would turn into slightly less massive stabbings, or, the debate about whether or not a truck driving down a congested walkway is more or less dangerous than a gun in a school. But we want to avoid that. We're just going to look at the actual ramifications of gun control and some of the other questions.
Well, in the Second Amendment, is the Second Amendment actually relevant anymore? Is that, what purpose does it serve in modern society?
Agreed. What's funny about it is that, the whole Second Amendment, so far as all the history books that I've ever read, kind of came from the idea that we fought for our freedom as colonials from an oppressive imperialistic nation. And if we did not have the means to raise arms against that, we wouldn't have separated and become our own country.
Right. These people that just want a war, they're like, well, we don't trust government. And that's pretty a modern idea too. That suspicion continues today.
Right.
One of my friends who he said, why do you liberals want to take guns away from the regular population when you're also pretty upset that you see cops killing Black people? And I was like, I have to give him that point. That's a really good point.
I agree. We're dealing with, police violence, and they have guns.
Yeah.
And, I think the UK has successfully gotten guns out of enough hands that the police officers walk around with nightsticks instead of guns these days. And they still have SWAT teams that are, when necessary in those situations. But, realistically, I don't think you can put the toothpaste back in the tube. And I don't think it's safe to say that, nobody should have guns or nobody should have assault rifles except the police and except the military.
Well, so we have this really great listener who wrote to me in terms of the gun situation, and he's a liberal, or I don't know if he's a person of color, LGBT, and he said, the thing that he really struggles with is a mass shooting occurs and his Facebook feed blows up with gun control, and he feels really frustrated by that as a gun owner. And one of the points that he made that I thought was pretty brilliant was, he said, if you're wealthy, you outsource your violence and your defense. You expect police or private security to take care of your personhood, your property, your family, but if you're poor or you're minority, you are actually responsible for that. You don't have that same privilege. You don't have that same access. And so then there's a different question for you. And I thought, well, that's a really good point, that there's a wealth connection to feeling like you don't have to deal with the messy work of defending yourself.
Yeah. And I think that, it's a tough situation, because at the end of the day, the police force, the military, all of these kinds of things should work in favor of all people. But, as with most privilege comes the knowledge that, or the lack of knowledge that the system doesn't always work right, and it doesn't work for different people. And I feel like gang violence helped lead to some of the initial gun control. I remember in the 90s, the banning of assault weapons, that was a federal ban on them. A lot of the citations as to why this was necessary and why the NRA and everybody even got involved in it came down to gang violence, trying to keep AK-47s out of drug dealer, gang runner, hands and things like that.
Which was code for minorities. And it's interesting. That's another thing that our listener pointed out that I didn't actually know about, was the Mulford Act in, I think it was 1967, and is one of the precursors to modern gun control, and came about because the original Black Panthers got sick of white cops abusing their power, and California decided to enact rules against Black people owning guns. And that's where we started this whole gun control situation, which interestingly, the other day, my partner was saying, if we could just get most of the Black people in the country to go buy assault rifles, they would be banned tomorrow. And this Mulford Act, he was saying that sort of in jest, but when you look at the history, actually, he's not wrong. And it's been this way for a long time.
It's kind of like my last Bicurian moment. I
Uh-huh.
can't believe the country hates women more than it loves guns.
Yeah.
But it's sort of true in that regard. And when you showed me that information on the Mulford Act, I was kind of surprised, but not actually all that surprised that
Yeah.
at the end of the day, they were more afraid of Black people owning guns than they were of losing their rights.
Yeah.
And so, in a lot of ways, though, I think the whole Second Amendment debate has really become about, as with so many things these days, it's really become about trying to cling on to something, some right. It in the liberal machine, of which I've been a part of, has cranked out all of this, rules and things like that, and why do people need guns and all of that. And after a little while, you've got people in different parts of the country and Montana going out and buying all of their guns and putting up a fence and hanging up a "Don't Tread on Me" flag and saying, this is what I'm going to do to draw a line in the sand against this. So I don't even know how many of those people are that passionate about it outside of the reaction to it, to the reaction of how it's been handled and pushed and all of that.
Well, it's become a reflex.
Right.
I'm actually neither pro-gun nor pro-gun control. I'm anti-slaughter, and I feel like limiting the conversation to whether or not someone has a gun overlooks the larger concern, which is that we have people in our country who, for one reason or another, genuinely believe that shooting concert goers and moviegoers and school children is a solution to their problems.
And it's not even. It's almost like whatever pain and suffering these people don't expect to survive most of the time. The whole suicide by cop thing is kind of in there.
Yeah.
They've just decided that they want to take out as many people with them, and it's their pain and suffering and their experiences and the things that maybe have hurt them or whatever. But the guns are a tool for a problem, that is so difficult to even pin down.
Right.
So the
And
question becomes, banning the guns, what next? And that is the one thing that I see even liberals, will just sort of shy away from. And I've been in that argument as a liberal, having that discussion about well, yeah, getting rid of guns could help. But what about trucks down a busy walkway? What about, so at the end of the day,
well, and that's the solution. I'm much more interested in that question. How do we stop wholesale slaughter for, because someone's upset? Or I'm not diminishing it, but that's the real question.
Right.
But this conversation about gun control and pro Second Amendment, I will say I definitely had that question of, why is this so important to you? Why do you want a gun? I don't really want a gun. So I can't get connected to that. And what I found with the folks that I've talked to about it is that it does consistently come down to a feeling of personal responsibility and a sense of accountability that that I'm responsible for my safety. I'm responsible for the safety of the people in my world. And I have determined that in order to achieve that, a gun is a defensive solution. And I'm not going to say that that's everybody's reason for wanting a gun. That does seem to be the consistent response from the people that I've spoken with in a variety of situations. And I get that. I get that feeling of personal responsibility. And I do think that the liberal community doesn't do a good job of encouraging a sense of personal responsibility. We definitely speak more about, victims and, collective, accountability. But there's a way in which we shy away from owning our own actions and rights and the risk of our ideals that I feel like the conservative community and the gun owners tend to be more invested in.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and I'll be the first to admit that the whole argument that I see thrown around on a lot of this stuff is no one needs an assault rifle. Sure, no one needs a lot of things. There's a lot of things that people don't need, but at the end of the day, an assault rifle is not anything but a tool,
mhm.
and people that want to own them do not tend to be the kind of people that go shoot people up. I mean, statistically speaking, there's like several tens of thousands of AR-15s were sold in January. And they didn't even see the spike with a shooting that happened because oftentimes with the fear of gun control happening,
People go by.
people go buy them afraid that they're going to get banned tomorrow. And they didn't even see that spike. It's just a very consistent number in the tens of thousands that gets sold monthly.
Wow.
So statistically speaking, the number of assault rifles that have actually been used in a mass shooting is very small.
That's a good point. So I was talking to you about this book that I love from like the 1950s golden age science fiction called The Weapon Shops of Isher, and I want to read a quote from it because I feel like it really sums up that argument around personal responsibility. When a people lose the courage to resist encroachment on their rights, they can't be saved by an outside force. Our belief is that people always have the kind of government they want and that individuals must bear the risks of freedom, even to the extent of giving their lives.
Which I love that idea. And I think what you're actually getting at is where a lot of people are at with the Second Amendment and the gun ban thing.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want encroachment on a right. It's just yet another right. We have the right to bear arms.
Well, and they see that right as a symbol for protecting all the other ones. That if you
literally won us our freedom.
Exactly.
And people, the other amendments on there were the rights to form militias too.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, these were legitimate claims that were made that were used to craft our country. So, revisionist history looks at it like, well, it didn't necessarily need all those. No, they did. They fought a bloody war and won us our freedom.
Yep.
And when they did that, they wrote this in and said, never again should a government be allowed to control the people.
Well, yeah.
I mean, that's what it was really about.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that one of the best arguments I've heard from the gun ownership crowd is, why should our military be better armed than we are?
Right. Well, and it's what our listener was writing about, that the difference between being wealthy enough to outsource your violence to the military versus owning the consequences and risks of your own freedoms. And I think it's a really good question to ask, as opposed to, do you think guns are good or bad? Because it's not. I mean, I think there are definitely people who are huge gun aficionados, and that's a different conversation.
I mean, most of the people that I've met that own guns, they're not sitting around saying, I need this, should there be a military coup and I need to defend myself from the military. They're like, this is cool.
Right.
That's
exactly.
literally their extent of appreciation of this. They like to go target shooting or hunting, and they think that gun they have is cool.
Mm-hmm. We like to hunt, and the recreational sport. I definitely have known a decent number of people for whom it is actually a self-defense commitment. I was hanging out with a guy several months ago, and we're talking, and we're becoming friends, and he said, I just need to tell you, I always carry. I was like, groceries? because
Right.
I'm not super connected to this whole community. And he's like, no, a gun. I was like, really? Like, what's that about? And he had just, at some point in the last 10 years, had just been one too many shootings. And so he went and got a gun and a license and training. But he had also been in the military, in like the special forces or military police, I think. And so he had the training to use it in terms of judgment. Because that's always been my thing, is like, there's this whole gun saves lives conversation. I have this little map here that we'll share that's got a self-defense, like these people saved lives in a shooting or whatever. And in the concept of that, like, okay, I get it, but I'm just like, having a gun isn't enough. Like, you also have to have the judgment to assess a situation and determine if you're going to increase the risk of the people that are involved, and are you going to accidentally shoot? Like, people die from friendly fire all the time. Like,
Right.
and so I think it's more complex than I'm going to buy a gun so my family's safe. And this guy actually was like, yeah, because I was like, tell me more about that. He's in the military police, and he talked about the situation. I said, well, it seems like you might be somebody for whom that's actually a relevant choice. I'm not that person. I'm really confident if I had a gun and I was in a situation, ultimately what I would do is either end up harming someone or giving whoever the aggressor is another weapon.
That is legitimate, and that actually leads into something else I heard. It was just an NPR story that they were airing, and with all the talk about arming the teachers to help prevent. So here was an interesting take on it. A bunch of like black teachers unions and stuff are getting together saying, we don't want guns because we're afraid of what's going to happen when the police run in and see a black guy standing there with a gun.
Yeah. Like,
They're legitimately like, that's not going to help us.
it's not going to help the kids, for sure.
Yeah.
Certainly
Like,
not
black
going to help
teachers are worried that they will be shot
Right.
immediately by police who assume they're the active shooter.
That makes sense, unfortunately. That makes sense. So the other thing that I find to be interesting in the larger conversation is we talk about gun control. It's passed legislation. We have a lot of legislation. And you should read this about the federal background system. It's really interesting. It's underfunded and not enforced. Like, if we use the stuff we had, things might be better.
Yeah. So I've often wondered about the background check system because it is undersourced and underfunded. That is a problem, and they're actually talking about, one of the things they need to do is fix that. However, a lot of these mass shootings would not be fixed by that. These were either attained legally. Currently in this country, it is not illegal to own a gun if you have been found to be mentally unfit in some way. And likewise, the gun control people have been pushing to get that and been fought on that because they don't want everybody who ever goes to see a shrink to be denied the right to buy a gun. And so it's caused an issue. But the background check system in theory works. But I mean, if you're a felon, you're not supposed to have a gun. If you are,
Well, just like, yeah, but even just this one, like, as of November of 2013, 12 states had submitted fewer than 100 records each to the national NICS in terms of like the database. 12 states
right.
had, like, that's it. So I'm not even sure, like, I don't think necessarily that the background checks, if someone was a felon, or the mental illness question, because it's really not, are you mentally ill? It's, do you have violent tendencies towards other people?
Right.
Lots of people are mentally ill and they're never going to harm anyone.
Yeah.
Like, only 134 people have gone around shooting people in our country. And we have something like 8 million people who are considered to be mentally ill. Like,
Right.
It's not.
And likewise, something that's really frustrating about this previous shooting in Florida that just, happened a few weeks ago. There was so many warning signs. It was reported to the FBI that people had concerns. His host family had concerns and told people about it. It just all got missed.
Right. Well,
And it's not even stuff that's in a background check.
Right. It was reported, and the and the really it's interesting because you don't know what's been stopped. So, for example, like if those concerns have been reported and people actually took them seriously and he didn't shoot anyone, that's not going to get reported anywhere. Like it's possible that we
Right.
have one mass shooting every 3 months or whatever, and we stop 450. Like there's not really any database that lets us know
Right. You
what
don't
our
know what
success ratio is
you
right
can't
now.
prove a negative.
And and I get it. Like one is one too many because it's just something that I think we as a society think shouldn't be happening. So, um,
Well, and our listener actually he wrote even more. And I kind of wanted to touch on this before we wrap. Who else benefits from the right to bear arms? He wrote. What many of the left fail to acknowledge is that marginalized populations have more to gain from bearing arms. I mean, I think that's all kind of a real point here. Like I
yeah,
said, that we can't just say ban all guns because the people that are going to suffer in that may not be who you think.
yeah,
And this is an argument internally for liberals to have. Like who's really benefiting? So who's really, suffering from all of that? So I think that's where the real issue lies for me is just knowing what exactly what are the real ramifications? Because it's easy as a knee-jerk response to just say, if there weren't guns, nobody get killed, nobody get shot. But that's not really how the world works.
it turns out if people are dedicated to killing someone, they're going to find a way. And I agree with no, the folks that are like the gun makes it easier. There's absolutely no question about that. If I want to kill you with my thoughts, you're much more likely to survive than if I point a gun at you and shoot you. Like, so, I mean, I'm not a great shot, so it might also not be successful. Um, I will tell you that my, my solution to this is actually I really love what that science fiction book had, The Weapon Shops of Isher, where they he conceived of a technology that made it so that you could buy a gun that was coded to you genetically and was only able to be used for defense. So it's not possible for someone to steal it and use it, and it's not possible for you to use it aggressively to murder someone. The only time you could use it is if somebody was attacking you. And that solution is not available to us today, so we have to come up with something that is actually possible. I felt like it was such a, great line between the two questions. And I kind of wish we could. I mean, you were saying that we have guns that can be coded to fingerprints. There's other
I
options.
mean, that technology was available in the 90s, and now I can open my phone by pushing, by rubbing my thumb on it. So, that technology could exist. We could have smart guns.
And so then the question of, is there a way to create a technology that also makes it impossible to use a gun for anything other than practice or self-defense? And I mean, I think we need to try and find radical creative solutions to this problem.
Yeah, I agree. It's a tough one. And like I said, a lot of the arguments are just not as cut and dry as getting rid of them. So, and besides, I'm a firm believer in not being able to put the toothpaste back in the tube. If every responsible, law-abiding gun owner went and turned in their guns tomorrow, I promise there'd still be a lot of guns out there, probably in the hands of people we would not be thrilled to have them in.
Yeah. Well, that's all I have.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I think we'll probably end up revisiting this. There seems to be a lot of stuff in the news on it, and I have a feeling that at some point before the recording of a show in the future here, we're going to have another mass shooting that's going to bring the debate right back up.
That's kind of a bummer.
It is a bummer. And now it's time for our Bicurian moment.
Which I'm really excited about.
Then I think you should go first.
Okay. So I found out today that Kyrsten Sinema, who is a congressional representative in Arizona, is been chosen to run for the Senate seat that Senator Flake is vacating. And I first ran into Kyrsten when I took a class here in Colorado called the Colorado Progressive Leadership Fellow something or other. And she was teaching 2 of the weekends. And it was really amazing for me to meet her. She had been, at that point, she was running for Congress. She's now served for 3 terms. And I was at that time a little bit more cynical about politicians. And she was just so practical and committed. And I'm like, why do you want to run for office? And she's like, you can help more people. She was a social worker and she worked with refugees. And she said that the challenge of her situation was that she didn't have any power to actually do anything to make things better. She could get them food or something like that, but she couldn't actually change things. And so she ran for state Congress in Arizona and won as an openly bisexual single feminist. I mean,
beautiful.
I know.
It's right up your alley.
Yeah, she was so amazing. But the fact that she did that, she didn't compromise on who she was. And she said that her first year in office was a complete disaster. We were in this class. She was like, I was just totally committed to my ideals and I wouldn't compromise on anything. And you know what happens when you do that?
Nothing.
Nothing. She's getting into nothing done.
Right.
And so then she said, all right, I did this because I want to help more people. So that means I have to figure out how to get things done. And she wrote a book called Unite and Conquer and just talked about approaching politics from what do we agree on? And she's so funny. She goes, us liberals, we're all wonks. We've got our spreadsheets and our pie charts. They're boring. No one cares.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And then she taught this section on the unqualified apology. She said, if you're going to do anything political, you have to learn how to apologize. So she spent 2 hours talking to this room of like 30 activists on how to give an actual apology. And I asked her, I said, well, what if you're sorry for like how you affected someone, but not for what you did? And she goes, then you're not sorry. Don't say it. No one likes a liar. I was just like, oh, you're so fantastic.
That's beautiful.
So, and it's just reading about her. And like a lot of people are complaining, the Democratic folks in Arizona are like, oh, she doesn't really care about liberal issues. And I'm like, actually, I think she really does. But what she actually cares about is being effective. So she's working with GOP and she's working with Trump on the issues that matter to her and her constituents. And she's not getting so attached to ideals that she can't get things done. She learned that lesson her first year in office. She's like, I burned bridge after bridge. And you know what? It doesn't work. You have to decide to actually swallow your pride, swallow your righteousness, roll your sleeves up and figure out, if I can't achieve what I want, how many steps closer can I get to better? And then do it.
Right. She sounds amazing.
She's
can't
amazing.
wait to actually get to know more about her.
So
that's fantastic. Mine is more frivolous than helping people.
It's your turn. It's your turn to be frivolous.
It's my turn to be frivolous. So the upcoming movie release for the 80s Nostalgia Fest that it is going to be, Ready Player One, coming out soon. And I admit I'm excited about it, but I'm also terrified because I have watched the 80s nostalgia thing really starting to take off. And there's a lot of things I've read online about the 30-year nostalgia cycle. And about 30 years out, we start getting nostalgic for the times, that there were. So in the 80s, it was the 50s. In the 90s, it was the 60s. And now where we're caught up to where the 80s.
And next thing you know, acid wash jeans are coming back and no one wants to see that. Yeah,
I'm really worried about the 90s Nostalgia Fest. But I think this one's going to be interesting because I already, as a musician, I make music. And I've been working on a synthwave, retrowave project, which essentially means make music that sounds like it came out off the Tron soundtrack in the 80s. But this is really just going to pop culture crush everything with 80s. So it should be an interesting movie.
You need to schedule that release to coincide with the movie so you can ride that wave.
Right, or just after. But I'm already too late for the release of the movie. But it is interesting because it's a very big thing right now, and I've just been watching it swell up. And I think a movie that's going to really bring it to the forefront, complete with a DeLorean rolling around all over the place, should be an interesting take. And I'm curious to see how pop culture gets affected by it. So we'll see. We'll see if the movie's actually any good.
I'm excited.
I think it's going to be good.
It's going to be great.
Excellent. So we will talk to you on our next show. So stay tuned, and please, as always, drop any information, thoughts, and criticisms in the comments.
Yes. Thank you.